Hey, good day, everyone. So today's lesson is about sustaining our natural resources. If you'd like to follow along in the book, it's from page 72 to 93 in your textbooks, and you will have to go through it afterwards anyway. So let's look at natural resources in general. What are they? There are things like water, which we use for energy. Well, when we drink it, it's for drinking water. We need oil for energy and fuel. Things like forests, we need wood for burning, also a type of fuel. Rocks, they are naturally available. They are used for construction, like houses and shelter. And minerals we find in nature as well to make jewelry, things like glass, cans, and ceramics. And soils, primarily used in agriculture, we do need that to create, to produce our crops for food. And then animals as well, we need land for them um, for us to eat, to use as food, or for them to produce as wool, like sheep. And some animals we can actually use for recreation, like pets. Okay, so we have two types of agricultural resources, your primary and your secondary. Primary are things like oxygen, soil, the veldt, which the animals eat naturally, and the sun for solar energy, and all wildlife. And also humans. You see they are here in the middle of the partition. They are both primary and secondary. Okay, so this category are all things that occur naturally. Humans did not make it. It was there. And secondary resources are things humans made. Okay, they are in this humans on this section as well because they make the technology, or we make the technology that is used. Things like fertilizers, even drones, there's a technology we use these days in farming. Also, oil is made or refined by humans, used for fuel, and things like pesticides and herbicides that we spray on our crops are also secondary. Then how do we preserve these natural resources? We don't want it to run out. Okay, so first of all, when we farm with animals and crops, we need to use those that are adapted to certain farming conditions. If you're in the Kalahari in the desert, you will not farm with dairy cows because they are not acclimated to that dry and warm area. Nonetheless, maybe you have an indoor place like this in this picture where you can regulate the temperature and make sure they have enough food and water. But it's a bit uneconomical. This would primarily be more like in your Western Cape area and the Eastern Cape area where the climate is much better. Then secondly, we need to protect our soil quality. Okay, things that affect our soil quality are monocultures, like we mentioned so many months ago. Monocultures are when we grow only one type of crop, like say maize in your entire farm. That would not be good for the soil itself. We should rather use things like wheat and maize and so on, alternate between different crops because different crops uses different minerals. If we just plant maize, it'll use up all, let's say, manganese. It'll use up all the manganese and it won't be replenished. But if we use different types of crops, some of the minerals won't be used up and some of them will be replenished by different crops. Okay, then secondly, under quality, graze different veldt areas at different times. You don't want all your cattle, all your sheep grazing on the entire farm at the same time. You will make camps and you will rotate the animals in different camps to save your veldt. Then natural fertilizers like manure should be used. It's much more natural, and the microorganisms in the ground can decompose them much easier than our synthetic fertilizers. Then lastly, use water wisely. We should not waste water. We should not let it drip and run or be it shouldn't run off in the veld. Like when you irrigate the veld, it should not just run away or percolate through the soil. We want to use the maximum amount of water without overusing it because we can't get water back and rain is so scarce. Okay, then we look at soil. First of all, soil conservation and management. but focusing on soil degradation. Degradation is when we lose soil or the quality of the soil degrades. First of all is erosion. It has an effect on the soil degradation. Okay, so some causes of erosion. If you have too much rain, it can cause the water to wash away the soil and it goes into the oceans if it's at the coast. But in farming situations, if you plow up and down slopes instead of slope contours, it can make the ground wash away. Then also overgrazing. Overgrazing can also cause the plants to be rooted out and the soil to be made loose, and the soil can also wash away with the next rain. Then also, like we mentioned, monocultures can also use up the nutrients. When the veld is burned as well, it can degrade the soil, and artificial fertilizers can also be a cause of it. As you can see here, even in cities, the fact that we build cities, we are compacting soil and it is being degraded, and things like the global change can also have an effect on it. Okay, so some effects as well. When we have erosion, why is it so bad? So your topsoil contains most of the organic matter we need, which is fertile soil. When it's washed away, we can't get as much crops as we used to, farmers. So when the soil texture also breaks down, soil absorbs less water and the water table also drops. The water table is that water that's deep underneath the soil, and if we have boreholes, we can use that water to irrigate our land. But if the water table drops, boreholes won't be effective. And also soil can be washed away. And also this picture shows deforestation. If there's no more plants or trees to keep the soil where they are, they can wash away. And we can, if this was maybe a cliff, look at all the degradation and the erosion, the soil went away. We lose half of the area we could have planted trees or crops. So how can we avoid it, or how can we control it? First of all, plant a cover crop. Let's see this picture here. If you're not using the land for any type of crops, maybe not plant a tree on that spot, because it's not that easy to take out a tree, but plant something in that stead so that the soil isn't bare and so that the rain can't wash away the soil. Then secondly, don't over irrigate. So here's a water picture that says eco, use water wisely, just give enough water, not too much so that the soil washes away. Then also use wind breaks. Thirdly, you can see that the wind doesn't blow away all the soil. Then natural fertilizers should rather be used. This pretty picture here. Okay, use manure, it's much easier, it compacts the soil and it's much more natural. And also avoid too much tillage as well, because when you till the soil or loosen up the soil, it can also much more easier be blown away by the wind. Secondly, something like soil compaction can also degrade soil. So what is soil compaction? Soil compaction happens when things like tractors and our farm animals walk over the soil. These zones just show you where the soil can be compacted because of the weight of either the animal or the tractor. So this would be an example of good soil. You can see here there are open air spaces in between the soil particles. Water can easily go through. It percolates through the soil, and it can go to the lower layers. Here you can see it's normal compacted soil. So it's much more difficult for the water to go through this layer. But this is a completely compacted soil example here. The plant does look so healthy for starters, and the water is struggling to actually go through all the soil air spaces. So it's much harder for the surface water to percolate through all the air spaces and reach the roots of the plant. So you will have bad looking crops if you use compacted soil. Okay, so the effects again, less oxygen, water can't infiltrate the soil, and root growth is restricted. You can also see here that these roots it reaches farther down than this plant. in comparison, because here's enough air spaces in between the soil, the roots can easily grow and reach much further down, but this plant struggles. Okay, so how can we avoid compacting our soil? Firstly, if we have wet soil, in the case of the first example, don't let animals or machinery onto the soil because it will compact it. Wet soil compacts easier. And also don't till the soil too much, minimum tillage. If it's tilled too much, the air spaces are opened, more water can go deeper in, and as soon as an animal or a tractor goes over, it's compacted again. Then also, if the soil is compacted, use deep tillage. So try and till as deep down as possible to try and loosen up the soil. The next bit is soil salination. Okay, so what is salination? It is when the soil is more, when salt is left behind. All of the water is either drained out of the soil or evaporates on the surface of the soil, and then you are left with all the salt. And this also causes the soil to be infertile. Very little crops or even any type of plant grows in salt soil because it's a very difficult environment for them to grow. Okay, so causes of it is when the water table rises. Here's an example. This is a normal, healthy ecosystem where the water table is low. Here's a couple of trees, and their roots are growing very deep. They can get to the water, and precipitation of the rain and evaporation of water still happens. This is a normal ecosystem. And the second one is still rain, but the water table is now rising. And this pushes up salts to the surface. And as soon, well, in this case, maybe due to deforestation, there's not as much trees here and not as much felt. So there's water runoff. Water doesn't really go into the under the water table into the ground, and the water table is coming up now, and salts are being pushed upwards. And the last one we can see, these are actually patches of salt lying on the surface of the ground. And as soon as the salt reaches the surface, other vegetation and trees die, and there's open space again, and even the water table starts rising again. And as soon as this ground or the soil, I should stop playing around with this. As soon as it rises and reaches the top part of the soil, it becomes waterlogged. And too much water means there's less oxygen, means that the vegetation struggles to grow there. Okay, so how can we control or avoid the salination of happening? Again, plant trees. If you know there are certain plant species that can tolerate salinic soil, plant them so that they can use up most of the salts. So plant trees to prevent it more likely, and also more irrigation. As soon as you pour more water or flood irrigate the area, all the salts will be washed away, but really needs a lot of water. Then fourthly, we have soil acidification. Okay, so acidification occurs when the soil obviously becomes more acidic. So if you guys remember the pH scale, if it has a low pH, it's acidic. So it's about 7 and under, 7 being neutral. And if the pH becomes higher, say from 8 to 12 or 14, then it becomes more basic. Okay, now what causes the pH? It refers to this H here, which means hydrogen. So the more hydrogen you have, the more acidic it becomes. So you move this way on the scale. The less hydrogen is in the soil, the more basic it becomes. Okay, so if you have things like you use too much nitrate fertilizer, or other type of fertilizer would be ammonium fertilizer. If too much ammonia or too much nitrates go into the soil, more hydrogen is being put into the soil. Okay, as this fertilizer is being broken down by bacteria and so on, more hydrogen is being released into the soil. So naturally, there are usually other metals like magnesium and potassium and so on close to the surface of the plant roots, And the plants also want to uptake these minerals because they need it to grow. But as soon as these nitrates or ammonia come into the soil and they react with these metals that are in the soil, the metals release hydroxide. And as soon as the hydroxide is also released into the soil, water can form here. You guys can see it's H12O, which can become water, but there's still some hydrogen left into the soil. So it becomes an imbalance. So basically what all these fertilizers do is there will be too much hydrogen, loose hydrogen in the soil, and just this can't be absorbed by the plants. It needs to be either in the form of water to be absorbed, or along with some other metals like magnesium and so on. But if it's loose, it can't be absorbed. And if it's too acidic, again, some plants can't grow in acidic soil. Okay, so some of the effects is that some of the nutrients also can't be absorbed by the plant. Things like calcium, magnesium will decrease because now it's free in the soil and can't be absorbed. And then also plants' ability to use subsoil moisture is limited. There's only a couple of water here. Then some toxic aluminium can also be released into the soil due to the acidity of it. Okay, so how to avoid all of this? So again, use minimum fertilizers. If you have to use it, make sure they are specific to the soil type that you are farming on. Then also less irrigation, use only as much water as you need. All these things can be tested in labs and so on to know what type of soil you have and how much water is needed. Then also lime can be added. Lime actually cancels out acidity. And also lastly, acid tolerant crops, again as which I mentioned in the previous example. Plant plants which you know will be able to adapt to acidic soil, they'll be able to survive to it. Then also we look at pollution. Even in agriculture, we still have soil pollution in general. Okay, so soil pollution, the causes of it, well, it's kind of self-explanatory. Waste everywhere on the soil. So it can be from industrial waste, can be gases that go into the soil, can be chemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, insecticides, so on. Also from sewage systems and can leak in. Okay, here we have emissions, gas emissions that can go into the soil. Things like erosion can also cause some of the gases to much more easily go into the soil. All these things causes loss of biodiversity. More acids, nutrients, heavy metals, and so on. Okay, all of that causes pollution and it causes a loss of organic material. And as I mentioned, loss of biodiversity. Okay, so all of this means less food for us, less crops can be grown, less animals can be fed on the veldt. So how can we avoid soil pollution? By introducing certain microorganisms, things like your earthworms. Oh, they are so good decomposers. And also making sure that the microorganisms like bacteria and fungi as well survive within the soil, reintroduce them into the toxic soil. Then also certain plants can also absorb some toxins, certain metals that are good for the environment. Then also reduce chemicals, the chemicals that are like the fertilizers and things you put into the soil. And also reuse and recycle materials. Trying to see if there's something else I can mention. Yeah, to reduce your dumping of solid wastes, they reuse and recycle. All these things need to be picked up and recycled and compressed and so on. Everything to avoid or reducing the pollution. Then lastly, there's also biological soil degradation. So as mentioned, within the soil, there are things like fungi and all your microorganisms in the lower layers of the soil, and they are needed there to decompose everything. Decaying matter on the top of the soil going down, and any chemicals or toxins inside the soil, they decompose it, they break it down so that the soil stays healthy. Okay, so what causes the degradation of these things? If the toxins are too much, these microorganisms can die if there's not enough microorganisms to counteract the toxins. Also, if with compaction and so on, when less air goes into the soil, they die off. And Now again, if it causes an anaerobic condition, less oxygen. Also, too much waste, animal waste, can also cause the buildup of ammonia, and too much ammonia can cause the death of these organisms. Then soil erosion can cause the organisms to wash away. Also, too much tillage in the soil can also kill the microorganisms. And things like felt burning, well, the microorganisms burn to death. Okay, so how can we control or avoid all of this? Well, stop using pesticides. Don't over-irrigate too much water so that there's less oxygen in the soil. We have to try to reduce erosion, and we have to plant, as mentioned, mixed crops, not just maize or wheat, soya, a couple of other types of crops to keep the microorganisms healthy as well. Minimum tillage, and don't use too much fertilizers. Okay, so what is the conclusion we make out of all of this? The impact of soil degradation is the degraded soil. Why is it so bad? It equals lower yields. We will have less crop, less food to feed the masses, and it will cause a higher cost, meaning we have to use more fertilizers or more manure or more things we need to buy to make sure that the quality of our soil goes back to normal. So if you have a degraded soil, it's not good for the environment or for the farmers' pockets, because it takes a lot of money to get this degraded soil back to a healthy quality. Okay, moving on from soil to water. In farming instances, it's very important to also manage the water you have. Okay, so how do you know whether you have good quality or bad quality water? That's also very important to know, because good quality would be healthier for the environment and for your crops, and also obviously bad quality water is bad for your crops. It may have toxins inside. It can also, well, even if there isn't toxins in there, it can still be bad, and it won't cause the crops to grow as good as it should if it was using good quality water. Okay, so there are three ways or three characteristics that we grade what the quality of the water is, how good is the water. So first of all, we look at the physical characteristics, the temperature of the soil. If the temperature is too hot, that's also a cause of bad quality. The amount of solid particles in the soil. Well, in this case, you can see there's kind of no soil in the water. In this case, there's a lot of soil particles in the water, so we want less solid particles. Sorry, not soil, solid. Then turbidity refers to the cloudiness. In this case as well, this water sample is very cloudy. There's a lot of soil in there, but this one is clear. So the turbidity is better in this one. Then we look at chemical characteristics like the pH. Water is supposed to have a pH of 7. So you know if it's either higher or lower than 7, it's bad. Then your oxygen content, you want more oxygen in good water. You can see actually the oxygen bubbles in this glass. Then your nitrate levels shouldn't be too high. Phosphates also shouldn't be high. And there should be no pesticides in the water. If there's any trace of pesticides, you know you're working with bad quality. Then metals and salts should also be at a low level. Too many of it can cause it can be unsuitable for humans. Imagine drinking salt water of the ocean. It obviously makes you more thirsty and it's not good quality. Then thirdly is your biological characteristics. There should be no parasitic eggs or anything inside your water. Otherwise, it is bad and it can make you sick. Then also fecal bacteria, if there is manure in pieces in the water which has bacteria in it, it's also bad. It can cause things like diarrhea. And then there are indicator organisms. There are certain types of organisms that people test for when they do their water quality tests. And if the certain bacteria are present in the water, they know the water quality is bad, because a certain organisms can only survive in bad water, in bad quality water. And lastly is your taste and color. You can see the color is brown, orange. This one is clear. So based on the color, this one would be the better quality water. And also the taste. You don't want muddy tasting water. Then your sources and uses of water in South Africa, our main sources of water would be rain. So you have your high rainfall areas and low rainfall areas. In the Northern Cape, there is absolutely no rainfall at all, maybe only in January. So here it's not it's a water scarce area. But your main rainfall areas would be the Western Cape and also your Eastern Cape and Mpumalanga areas. So this is more your rain catchment areas, and also most of the dams are here. Yes, there are the Orange River and the Fall River in the middle of the country, but it's not the main sources of water. Your main sources is along the coast. Okay, so once we know where the water comes from and where our sources are in South Africa, how do we use it? Or in agriculture, how is the water used? So first of all, it's used in agriculture for irrigation, how we get the water to the croplands. Then also, it can be used for household and animal consumption. Obviously, animals need to drink the water, and we as humans also need to drink the water. Thirdly, for freshwater fish farming, we obviously need water if we want to farm fish. And for hydroponics, if you guys remember, hydroponics is a farming method where you don't use soil at all. In these tubes are water. So it's a soil-less way of farming. So only water is used, much cleaner, and the yield of the crops is much higher. Then water is also used for dipping animals. Here, sheep are being dipped. If you buy the chemicals from the shops, you need to dilute it in water, and then it's either sprayed on the animal or they have these water baths or big dipping baths where the animals actually walk through and without being dipped. And lastly, for cleaning in dairy farms and so on, they need to clean the place to keep it, they need to clean the urine and the manure away to keep it hygienic. And also hot water usually is used in abattoirs for washing and sterilizing equipment and so on, to wash the floors and walls, also to get all this urine and manure out of the place. Okay, then factors that affect water supply. What can decrease water supply in our country? First of all, droughts. If you have less rainfall and more hot episodes in the country, droughts can occur and we lose the amount of water. Then secondly is our groundwater aquifers, and the aquifer is down here. So with a well or borehole, we can also utilize water from the aquifer. But what sometimes can happen is the water is stored for millions of years and it can be used up. So if the well or the borehole uses up all the water, it is gone from this source. So we need to use water from this source very sparingly and also very consciously, because again, when the next rainfall comes, the aquifer can be refilled when water drains through all the soil particles, and then from the bottom up, it can fill the aquifer. Then thirdly, didn't show it here, but things like global warming can also affect our water supplies. And then alien vegetation, or vegetation that's not endemic or doesn't come from our country. Here's a pretty flower, but certain crops also does not come from South Africa. They use much more water than our natural plants. It reduces the amount of available groundwater, and the volume of runoff also reaches the river. Okay, so alien plants, they use up much more water than our own indigenous plants. Then our favorite pollution, water pollution in this case. It can also affect the amount of water we have, the amount of clean water we can use. So in agriculture, what causes pollution? Your fertilizers, your pesticides. Again, over irrigation, because if we use too much water, it can run off the crop felt and can wash away all these fertilizers and pesticides into the oceans or even into these aquifers that we need to use later on. Then your organic waste, like manure, if you use too much, and not all of it can be degraded by organisms, it can be washed into the oceans and into our river system. You can also pollute that. Okay, so how can we prevent water pollution? First of all, again, reduce erosion, plant your trees and things. Don't let the soil and all these organic wastes wash away. Then minimal fertilizers and pesticides, don't let it be washed into the oceans. Use only the amount you know will be absorbed by the soil and the plants. Then keep animals away from water sources. Why? Because when they drink from a river, they usually defecate in the water. So if the manure falls into the water, again, it can be organic waste, too much phosphates go into the water, too much urea. So in overall, if it builds up, it's bad for your water sources. Okay, then we get to agricultural pollution. It also mentions again your soil and your water pollution. So I skipped this in your textbooks. It's just the same we went through earlier in the video. Then lastly is your waste management. What it's very important in your agricultural setup. There are 3 types of waste: your solid waste, like your manure, and also your bedding for animals. There's also waste because you have to throw it away, because there can also be dung and urine inside this bedding. Firstly, solid, yes, and then your liquid, called effluent. Can either be effluent water waste or from slurries. It's things like your also manure and urine being washed away into waterways. Then thirdly, non-natural can be like rusty tractors and rusty tools, machinery and things standing around, and things like old tires. It's not natural, it can't be degraded, it will stay like this for maybe not thousands of years, but many years. So basically it should be managed. First of all, your solid wastes, your manures and things, you can actually reuse it, and like the manure of organic it's organic waste and can be used to sorry, I'm trying to read at the same time. It can be used to fertilize the soil again. Searching for the word. Okay, so the manure and the bedding can be collected. It can be stored in waterproof containers. If you don't want to use it immediately, you can use it later on. Yes, it should be placed onto the crops because it has lots of nutrients and minerals which can benefit the soil. But again, don't overuse it. Only when needed. Store it when it shouldn't be used. And don't apply it to the soil just before it's going to rain, because as we mentioned, if it rains with the soil erosion and everything, it will just end up in the waterways again, polluting the waterways. So then with your liquid waste, like your liquid manure and your urine, it should also be stored away and can also be used as a type of fertilizer for your crops. And it's also a much better way than your solid manure, because with the water it can be quickly absorbed by the soil and it can be absorbed by the plants much quicker. So you don't have to use as much. But personally, I think it's easier to store the solid manure and bedding than the liquids. The liquids will start to stink quicker as well. Then lastly, your non-natural waste. It should also be reused, but I think it takes a bit more creativity to reuse these, because things like tires, you can maybe make a small playground out of it, or if you have animals, maybe utilize it in the enclosures where the cattle and sheep walk, maybe, or even can be used to make troughs, feeding troughs for the animals. Farmers really have to think creative when they reuse these. It's not so easy to do it. And with your old tools and machinery that's a bit rusted, it is bad for the environment if it's just standing there, but it can also be reused, sometimes painted over, and it can be a nice ornamental thing on the farm. But it's important for farmers to actually reuse these things as well, because if they heap up, like in the case of the tires, it is a sort of pollution. Especially with tires, when it starts to rain, it will actually increase the amount of mosquitoes in the environment, because water catches inside of the tires, and stagnant water is the best place for mosquitoes to breed. So it's actually very important to reuse these things to make sure that it doesn't breed other pests and things that can cause disease in the environment. And also rust in general is very bad for the environment. It's also dust pollution. But if it's repainted and this machine or tool is given new life, it's always better for the environment. Okay, so that concludes this class. So yeah.